Why don't you give me, for instance, about how the Constitution actually is designed to facilitate productive disagreement rather than productive unity?
Yeah. So, I mean, for example, the foremost institution of our national government is the Congress, the national legislature. And the way the Congress is intended to function is actually different in a way that we have to pay attention to from the ways in which a lot of democratic parliaments function. The Congress does not empower the narrowest of majorities to act in an assertive way. If you have a narrow majority in Congress, you've got to broaden that majority before you have any power. And the reason for that is that the Constitution is built on a concern about majority power. So that even though majority rule is ultimately the source of legitimacy in a democratic system, majority rule is also dangerous. You don't have to look too long at American history or really at the history of any democracy to see that that's true. And the system deals with that by forcing majorities to grow before they can be empowered. And that means that even when you win an election, you still have to deal with the people that you defeated. You still have to deal with the people who are around the table. And what you win in an American election is a seat at the negotiating table rather than the power to do anything and everything you want. That's very frustrating to a lot of people, and you find a lot of pointing in the direction of parliamentary systems in the criticisms of the Constitution that you get from progressives 100 years ago as much as today. But the American system says, no, you don't just get to do whatever you want by winning an election. An election decides who will be part of the process of working this out. And that process is a process of negotiation, a process of competition. When you look at the other parts of the system, you look at federalism, there again, the logic is not that we're going to come to one solution and the challenge for our government is to implement it. The idea is that there's going to be a permanent and continuous process of pushing and pulling and tugging and negotiating and working it out. And that ultimately is how we arrive at constructive modes of governing.
So let's just get this low-hanging fruit out of the way for a second. I brought it up on here, brought it up with you. This whole democracy or republic thing, you've been working on this question. We got colleagues who've been working on this question. We've had seminars about this question. Is it fair to say that democracy is the part where it's the means by which we pick the people who are going to be in the room to have these negotiations, and the people in this room using their judgment and their best and they're relying upon their sort of virtue and the best versions of themselves is the Republican part? I mean, how do we separate out Republican and Democratic? How exhausted are you every time somebody says, we aren't a democracy, we're a republic?
Yeah, I think that's not a very constructive. I think that's not a very constructive critique of any argument about the Constitution. We are a democratic republic. That term is internally inconsistent on purpose, and I think that kind of containing of what seem to be opposites is actually one of the modes by which our Constitution works. So we absolutely do live under a system that takes it for granted that the source of political legitimacy is majority rule, and that majority rule is really ultimately the only way to determine the direction of a self-governing politics. And yet also sees that majority rule is a very dangerous thing, and majority rule can be very unwieldy and ineffective. And so it puts up a kind of balance that involves something more like deliberation and consultation and negotiation and bargaining. And in some ways, that is more Republican. The term Republican is just endlessly frustrating and complicated. And for us, it's a hard term to define because it's kind of gone out of use in our political vocabulary. And parts of it have become part of what we mean by liberalism. Parts of it are what we mean by democracy. Parts of it really are just gone. But republic is also very hard to define when you look at the political discourse of the founding era. And in some ways, they had the opposite problem. Their republic kind of meant everything,
Right.
and everybody wanted to be understood as Republican. And so, for Madison in the Federalist says that he wants to distinguish Republican from monarchy, and not just from democracy, but also from democracy, by which he means something more like radical democracy, where the people rule directly. And the uses of Republican are very hard to track and very hard to pin down. To my mind, Republicanism is something like the political vision of a self-governing society. It focuses on taking ownership of your society's present and future, of talking about it in terms of something that is your responsibility. And so it counterbalances the democratic ethos because it values not just what we each want, but also what our society needs. It counterbalances a kind of liberal ethos because it values not just rights, but also obligations. And I think a lot of times when we talk about, I would say when I hear critics of liberalism saying our problem in America is that we have too much liberalism, I think that the best among them really mean that we have too little republicanism, that we have too little of a focus on the common good and on obligations alongside rights. But we are a republic and we are a democracy. And the Constitution is certainly a democratic document. I think the progressive critics of it who say that it's not are mistaken about the character of the Constitution. It assumes in an underlying way that majority rule is the only source of legitimacy. But it also sees that majority rule is not the end of the story, and that it's not enough when we think about the kinds of challenges we face. So not all the offices, and not even all the offices that are elected, are best understood as representative offices, and in that sense, in the most direct democratic way. We understand that there's a need to mitigate majority rule, and some of the ways it's mitigated, I think, are distinctly Republican in the American system. That's just a way of saying this is a messy soup. It doesn't really clarify it. And as you say, we've been working on this problem, our kind of friends at AEI and others, and that's because I think there is some value in recovering the language of republicanism, but it's not a simple matter.
So this all, I have a vision of our endpoint here, where you rip off your mic and storm out of the room. So, but we'll get
Excellent.
there. In the meantime, so you said something along the lines, it's messy and complicated by design. That this is something that's in the book. You have this great stuff about the role of competition in our system, which is sort of underappreciated. It seems to me like, so as you know, Woodrow Wilson's not a friend of this podcast, and
Yes. Not a friend of this book either. I'm not quite the vice president of the Woodrow Wilson Haters Club by the end of writing this book, but I'm very, very high in the ranks of the organization.
Right. So like the cult of unity, I mean, if you take it seriously, right, the cult of unity despises competition. And
yes.
Wilson talks about this. He thinks the idea of checks and balances is absurd. It's the idea, he compares it to the idea of like somehow the organs of the body fighting with each other.
Exactly.
And that the body politic needs to be an organic, holistic whole, everything working together, all oars pulling in the same direction. And somewhere de Tocqueville says this is, calls something an example of a clear but false idea. It is a very seductive idea. It's just not true.
Yeah.
This idea that, that's the way the government should work or whatever, and all sorts of other things in life. Can you sort of point to sort of get to this point about the inherent contradictions and deliberate ambiguities about like the role of the president, the role of, you got into it a little bit conceptually with democracy versus Republican, but it's actually pretty concretized ambiguity in the actual structure and plain letter of the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really part of the way in which the Constitution goes about addressing divisions and problems and resolving disputes in our society. I think that the foremost way that it does that is through competition, and it sets competing factions in competition with each other through elections, but also through the ways that the branches of our government relate and through federalism. It also does it by compelling negotiation in a fairly obvious way, and especially in Congress. But there is a third way that the Constitution deals with fundamental differences that were present at the time of its writing and that are present in the life of our society. And that is that it takes what seem to be competing ideas, necessarily competing ideas, and encompasses them both within the system. And so the most familiar example of this is really in the grand compromise that made the Constitution possible, the compromise between the large states and the small states. The large states wanted representation in Congress to function by population. The small states wanted all the states to be equal in representation. And at a certain point, the Connecticut delegation says, well, we have two houses here. Why don't we just have one of them look like this and the other look like that? And on the surface, that doesn't make any sense. You haven't decided how to solve this problem. And yet, by containing the disagreement within the structure of the institution, you allow it to continue in such a way that both interests are represented, and the tension between them is, in a sense, the life of the system. And actually, when you see that, you realize the Constitution does this over and over, again and again, not only in setting up federalism and the design of the Congress. As you say, the nature of the presidency, there was a basic question. Is the president just executing the laws? Is the president basically just a glorified clerk? Or is the president the head of state and the most elevated figure in our politics? These are very different things. And the Constitution answers that question by saying, yes, the president is a glorified clerk and the president is a head of state. And the office just contains both of those things. And what that allows you to do is, at different times, the system can kind of shift its weight without losing its balance and falling over. It can be different things given different kinds of needs and exigencies, and it doesn't have to resolve the problem. And there are some kinds of political disputes that were central to the differences at the convention and that are central to the life of the American Republic that are just answered with a yes and that's very frustrating. It means the American system of government is not coherent. I think we have to accept that it's not simply coherent. It doesn't answer to a clean political theory. And that obviously is frustrating to political theorists inclined to cleanliness. And I think that Woodrow Wilson was such a person. And he looked at the system and he said, this is just a mess. This doesn't make any sense. No one's clearly in charge. It pulls in all different directions. He had that analogy, as you say, to the Newtonian system and the Darwinian system. And he says the Madisonian answer is Newtonian. It's this machine that's in balance. But in fact, our system of government is an organism. And in an organism, if the organs don't all pull in the same direction, you're going to die. I think Wilson is just mistaken about the nature of political life. And what he does above all, and I think this is something that comes into clearest focus when you think about the Constitution in terms of cohesion and in a divided time like ours, is that Wilson underestimates the danger of disunity. He underestimates the risks involved in tension and disagreement and division. And he calls Madison's Constitution overly simplistic because he says we're living in an industrializing time and the world's more complicated, and maybe this worked back in the late 18th century, but it doesn't work in the late 19th century. And a lot of contemporary critics of the Constitution, a lot of these kind of law professors who are tired of the law and who've decided that we need to throw this away and have a much simpler democratic system, I think are making the same mistake. They fail to see, they call the Constitution simple-minded, but it's much more sophisticated than they are about what is really the most profound challenge to the life of a modern democratic nation, which is the challenge of internal diversity. Diversity is a term we use now to talk about demographics or to talk about ethnicity and race, but it can also just mean diversity of views. And the simple reality of diversity that defines all modern societies, the way in which we are modern, is that our society contains intense disagreements. And the American Constitution, in a very unusual way, is built to contain the danger of that and to address the problems that creates. And I think for that reason, not from authority, not because it was Madison's, not because we've had it for so long, but because it is the answer to the problem we now face. For that reason, we have to reacquaint ourselves with the Constitution and recommit ourselves to it. I simply think that it is the solution and not the problem in the moment we're living in.